It also has physical proximity to the places where the good work is in the garment industries and in domestic service in the wealthy neighborhoods there, and a certain physical flexibility on the ground, a sense that nobody's going to bulldoze it soon, although they could any time now, which allows you to open small businesses and so on in it. So while being miserable, it's a desirable place for the people there. As a result, it has an incredibly high population density, and there's been absolutely no face of government there. Some aid agencies have done some work there, and you see the fruits of that are a running water system improvised by the people there, in which hundreds of rubber hoses hiss with water as you walk down the streets, drawn from tapped-in city water mains to provide water, for which people pay. The first utility to come into this slum was cable TV, which is true around the world. I've seen it in Mumbai, in Rio de Janeiro, in some parts of Africa and so on. The first utility is always the cable TV person, who usually has mafioso levels of power over the neighborhood as the controller of sort of the statistical knowledge of people and the exchange of money. And it's usually many years after cable TV comes in that things like water and sewage come in. Electricity is never an issue because it's tapped off the water line. When you get inside here, you find there's a flourishing world of commerce and business here, in which people use their physical space to open shops and small factories, doing all manner of things, video rental, all manners of food provision and restaurants and so on, the very smallest levels of business. A couple of video arcades for the slum residents, which often substitute for any form of childcare, which is not available, except informally through personal exchange. Photo studios, English language classes, very popular and provided through sort of informal networks within the village, and these schools with big bold signs. And there's a thriving garment district within the slum, in which the people who own it are beginning to have 10, 15, 20 employees in their slum dweller-owned garment shops, which are beginning to supplement the official garment factories in Dhaka, which has the lowest wages in the world, famously for it's stolen a lot of business away from China, which is now priced itself out of the lowest end of the garment trade. These guys are trying to price themselves below the main Bangladeshi prices. However, the wages have been rising. There's been a huge labor movement in Bangladesh, so the wages have more than doubled in the past year, partly because of the types of organization that happen here. You also get metalworking shops in here. There's a whole metalworking district inside the slum, woodworking shops, and so on. So it is a dire, destitute place. It's also a place that is very carefully trying to leverage itself up to be a different sort of place. This woman I met and spent quite some time with in the book is an example of somebody who had made huge investments, essentially had her family had saved in her village to send her and her husband in to make a go of it, try to educate their children and so on. And it almost worked. And often the mathematics of this rural to urban transition are very carefully calculated, and they're based on certain assumptions. And if one factor falls out, it can all come crashing down. In her case, her husband, who is a pedal rickshaw puller, a very high mortality rate job, died of perhaps exhaustion, perhaps drugs, perhaps accidents, all the things that kill these guys. This caused her to have to decide between having her 6-year-old daughter, her only friend in the world, or having her job at the garment factory. And she couldn't have both, so she's essentially put her daughter into what is in effect an orphanage. You can see her once a month. And every day after her work at the garment factory, she comes home and sobs here for her daughter. And there are great amounts of this sort of personal misery in this. And often it causes a sort of defensive personal politics of a whole set of defensive mechanisms, which often include returns to religion. Women in Bangladesh don't cover their heads, generally speaking. When they migrate to London, they generally do. Why? It's because sort of an atavistic return to a religious sensibility which seems to protect you a little bit more. We see that all over the world right now. And you can get this sense when you're in Karel and places like this all over the world that these places are teetering between two possible situations, one of which in which this welter of entrepreneurship and so on within them, this great effort to move the children into education, into the established core of the city, is able to succeed and create something of a middle class coming from in these places, either moving people out of them or allowing a building up of the neighborhood itself into something more than a slum, into something better. And we've seen that in many places. Right now, both Turkey and Brazil are governed by movements that have risen out of places like this and that have formed on the outskirts. Istanbul, which went from under 1 million people in 1960 to over 12 million people now, has had these self-built houses that fill the outskirts for miles and miles, generate their own potent middle class, which has created the political movement that now runs Turkey and is a much more pro-European, pro-trade sort of movement than the previous nationalist governments of Turkey. The Brazilian government of Lula da Silva has personally come out of the favelas, which are rural to urban transition neighborhoods on the edge, and has created politics out of there, which again is much more economically open and so on. So these are not always destructive movements. On the other hand, I do look at what happened in Iran, and I would argue that the 1979 revolution was a product of neighborhoods like this being allowed to not succeed. I would argue that the rise of a lot of forms of Hindu nationalism in India, particularly in Mumbai, particularly the ones that caused Mumbai to be called Mumbai now, were products of exactly this sort of neglect of the arrival city, of the failure to allow it to happen. So I look at Mumbai. This is in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where I find neighborhoods that have changed from being outrageously violent and deadly to being reasonably stable, successful, blue-collar neighborhoods with a future through considerable efforts and activism from within them. This is Liu Gongli in the center of China in Chongqing, which is a self-built neighborhood that I examined carefully in the beginning, which I've just learned is going to be bulldozed next year, all 200,000 people of it, and with some interesting implications. This is Nairobi, Kenya, where I look at one of the more difficult arrival city situations, but I would say even the most destitute slums of sub-Saharan Africa are improvements over the village life from which people come. Almost anybody you ask there in these neighborhoods will tell you, yes, my daughter might have to sell individual cigarettes on the street here, but if I'm back in the village, my daughter dies of starvation. Because 3/4 of the lethal malnutrition and poverty in the world take place in subsistence-level agricultural villages. And this here is the very southern fringe of Tehran as it dissolves into the desert, and it's the place where the latest wave, and probably the last wave of migration, because Iran has become a country that's gone into population shrinkage because its population growth rates have gone down. But these are the places where a great unhappiness with the current regime, much as these neighborhoods had a great unhappiness with the Shah in the late 1970s, has arisen, and I get a sense of a type of disenchantment with the lack of social mobility that could result in something in the future. So this is a whirlwind photographic tour of the arrival cities of the world. We can talk a little bit more about the ones closer to home and the way these sort of transitions in economics work in Canada, in the United States, in Western Europe, and the way that they haven't worked, and so on. But thank you very much.